I'm Aaron Sagers, and this is Talking Strange.
Hey, spooky nerds. On this episode of Talking Strange, I'm very stoked because I'm talking to Chuck Russell, who is an iconic director of so many movies, including A Nightmare on Elm Street 3, Dream Warriors, which is my favorite of the whole Nightmare on Elm Street franchise. And we are in luck because this episode is brought to you by G Fuel and their new Dream Demon Energy drink, which is inspired by A Nightmare on Elm Street. All right, so we're going to drink it up. I'm going to stay awake, and you check out this episode with Chuck Russell.
Chuck, good to see you, friend.
Hey, Aaron, how are you?
I am great. I'm great. I'm so happy to be talking to you again. Now we had just been conferring a little bit before we hit record. We're both kind of feeling a little bleary-eyed, and perhaps allergies and sniffles are attacking us. You're on set right now. Well, not right now, but you're in New Orleans doing some additional filming for Witchboard.
Correct. We're night shooting Bourbon Street and getting a lot of the New Orleans atmosphere the movie requires. So I was up late, and so I can do this interview, and then we start at noon today, and we go as late as we need to go.
Holy moly! Well, so New Orleans really is going to be a character in this film.
Yeah, absolutely. And the more time I spend here, it's an amazing place. I was here probably 10 years ago, briefly, but that was for fun. But to actually shoot here with a great team, it's just amazing. The life, the in the French Quarter, the street life, the locals, the tourists, the kids playing drums on plastic buckets. It's a remarkable place, visually amazing.
Yeah, I'm of the opinion, look, Hollywood and production is magic, right? And you could do a lot with backlots. You could do a lot by shooting in Atlanta or other places. And I know you guys also filmed in Montreal a bit, but you still need, sort of like New York City, there's some places like New Orleans, you need to at least get your boots on the ground when you're filming if it's going to be set there.
Absolutely. Honestly, it's an old film school rule, a sense of place. Whether that's world building fantasy or whether for us it's a place like New Orleans, you want to get the grit, you want to really take the audience there. And I think the locations are always part of the character of the movie.
Before we shift topics, I think it's worth speaking about right up top, because some people might be wondering, all right, how is Chuck filming this movie right now, considering the SAG-AFTRA and WGA strikes? So could you just address that a little bit?
It's happened for a lot of reasons. We fully support the strike and the unions involved with it. I actually support both sides. I want to see them work it out as quickly as possible. We were granted a waiver on Witchboard. We're encouraged to continue because we're a truly independent film, and we've agreed to whatever terms SAG settles at. And therefore, we're continuing. We're not shooting with actors right now, though, and we're just shooting street material. I wanted to get more Bourbon Street flavor here in New Orleans, and get a little deeper of that magical atmosphere that's natural to this place. So we're just doing street stuff right now, and some of the street life on Bourbon Street with a small team. Last couple of days of work that we thought would spice the film up.
Well, let's shift gears from the Crescent City to the Windy City, because you grew up right in Chicago, or were you a little bit in the burbs?
I was in the suburbs in Park Ridge. I worked in the city in the summers as a lifeguard, so I got and honestly, Lincoln Park is a theater street in Chicago, has been, and also Second City was, I believe it's still there. So I really got a dose of comedy improv and local theater at that time. So Chicago is an amazing city that'll always be part of me, and it was an incredible place to grow up.
How did it get kind of imbue your horror DNA?
I don't know if my horror DNA has much to do with Chicago, but I was a big fan as a kid of horror and fantasy. And it occurred to me, probably when I was still even in grade school, it occurred to me that was somebody's job. that somebody's dad went to work every day and made creatures and came up with these remarkable ideas. So it was, it was what I saw on television originally and in the theaters that really inspired me for no good reason to imagine I could do it.
I mean, I was just thinking you may have been moved out to LA by this point, but Kolchak, the Night Stalker, was set, not the movies, but the series was set in Chicago.
Correct. I don't know if I didn't come here until I just kind of finished college early, and I drove straight to LA. I had no idea what would happen. I got a job sweeping stages and I was delighted.
I well, I'm also always trying to work Kolchak into a conversation because I love Aaron McGavin. So
no, it's a great series. Don't get me wrong. No,
well, yeah, I want to talk a little bit about Dreamscape, as I said, and I think we talked a little bit before when we first met back at San Diego Comic-Con. I absolutely love that movie, and you really do have these powerhouse actors. Along with Christopher Plummer and Max von Sydow, you have Dennis Quaid and Kate Capshaw, and this film, it's burned in my brain. The lizard man, the nightmare realm that we saw when you were writing that. What's sort of the appeal for you? Was that kind of a personal story? I mean, were you a kid of nightmares? Did you want to know that you wanted to dip into the dreamscape?
I definitely had some weird combination of lucid dreaming and repetitive nightmares when I was a kid. So I just found it absolutely fascinating. I actually did some research with some great dream researchers at Stanford, which were the best in the country at the time. They may still be. And the lizard man was inspired by a young man we weren't allowed to interview. We didn't really want to get in his life. I think he was only 10 or 11 years old, who was having a very strong reoccurring nightmare with a particular creature. And I thought that was so upsetting. It was exactly the kind of thing our fictitious dream researchers would try to address. So I got deep into it, and I've learned something like 3 to 5% of us are natural lucid dreamers. And the group we worked with at the time called themselves Nirmanauts, which means going into dreams. And they would teach college students who had the ability how to lucid dream. I just thought the whole thing was fascinating.
Well,
may I say, David Lowery wrote the script originally, was a great creative partner throughout the process, and Joe Rubin, who directed it, was is an old friend and was kind enough to give me kind of a lead in writing and even storyboarding, and I did a little bit of everything on that show.
Yeah, how do you think that set the stage for leading into Dream Warriors?
Apparently it did specifically. I wasn't really aware of this at the time, but I had a reputation for having pulled that film together, and Bob Shea was concerned about what the next step would be with Nightmare on Elm Street. Look, it's a classic series. I don't want to diss any part of it, but at that time, after number 2, they were concerned about the commerciality of moving forward. And I was basically said, if I could come up with the right concepts, I could have my first time directing gig. There was a script originally by Wes and Bruce Wagner, and I was lucky enough to bring my partner Frank Darabont in at the time to do a rewrite on that piece, and we proved to New Line that we could do something really fantastic.
Yeah, the kind of the Hollywood lore is that Wes's idea originally was, perhaps Wes stepped kind of back in, according to the stories, because people were not overly thrilled with the second installment, and Wes Craven and Bruce Wagner had sort of this darker take, and then you had to kind of work partially with that, you and Frank. Was it about 70% of Wes's kind of idea that had to be changed?
It's so hard to say that. We had a great script to start with, a great story, particularly the concept of the kids, suicidal teens in a lockup. And I actually volunteered for a few weeks at a halfway house for suicidal teens in Hollywood before we started writing that draft. And I still find that incredibly compelling. I think it's one of the reasons it's still resonant over the years. Is there's a sense of sadness, and there's the ultimate underdogs. It's a group of suicidal teens in a lockup, and it's a real thing. So I was trying to do them some honor after I met some of these kids. So ultimately, there's an interesting kind of a little bit of sadness behind them as no one believes them. They're already suicidal in a lockup. About Freddy coming after them. So it really helped me balance the horror with a character-based love for those characters. And I was able to bring in what I call character-based comedy, which is just the right touch, because laughs and screams are very similar dynamics with the setups and payoffs in cinema. It's surprisingly similar.
Yeah, there's this notion. I mean, one of the notes I wrote down, I was like, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest meets comic book kind of, epic takedowns, and of course the horror sensibilities. But something I enjoy about it is this kind of amalgam of two themes we see in film that people might think you're crazy and they don't believe you. And then people tend to not believe teenage characters. But then when you combine both of those things, and then you add in sort of this mental illness element to it, it does create this extra complexity, I would say.
Listen, I got to give Wes credit for that, because the initial concept in his first nightmare that was so disturbing, there's a point in all our lives that I could really relate to, where you're just coming of age, you're whether it's a teenager or a teenager, kind of just getting into the high school years, where you're realizing somebody close to you can die. Wars happen. You might even get drafted, back in those days. So you start to realize it's not all fairy tales and sugar plums, and that you can't entirely trust adults. That makes kids bond at that time. And it's very fertile for a horror film where no one believes you. Mm-hmm. That experience where no one believes your view of the world is a universal experience at that age. It's also one of the ages where you're really bonded with your friends before college, before families of your own. It's one of the last times where those are the people your friends become the most important people in your lives. So I think that however that came to Wes in the first place, beyond the concept of Freddy, that gives you great characters and great character issues to work with as a filmmaker.
It seems almost glib to ask after that very insightful response, but the origin of the line "bastard son of 100 maniacs," I think it's something that, well, obviously,
Darabont wanted to kill me. Darabont wanted to kill me for that line.
That's yours.
At the time, yes. He was like, "You can't say that." And in that decade, I guess it was a little edgy. I guess these days it's not that big of a deal. But I thought, let's take this concept of where Freddy came from. It's the third in the series. We got to get deeper into why this is happening and who that character is. And the eerier it could get, the better. And we were actually in a cabin. We had like 11 days to do our draft or something. So it was kind of a race. It was actually a classic, great situation for a good writing partner. And there were a couple of things where Frank said, that's going to be horrible. It's not going to work. And I just said, we gotta thrill this audience. And they're pretty jaded from the first one.
1, 2, Freddy's coming for you. So we all know the best way to stay away from Freddy Krueger's razor claws is to stay alert, right? Right. Well, consider G Fuel, the #1 energy drink of gaming, anime, and pop culture, which is your official Freddy repellent. And G Fuel is celebrating the iconic A Nightmare on Elm Street franchise and its sinister star, who we all know and love, with an all-new flavor, G Fuel Dream Demon. This energizing fruit punch blend is the perfect beverage for aspiring dream warriors everywhere. It's formulated with 140 milligrams of caffeine per serving and packed with vitamins, antioxidants to give you the game-changing energy and killer focus to keep the Springwood slasher at bay. And it has zero sugar, zero jitters, and zero crash. So stay out of the boiler room by stocking up on ready-to-drink G Fuel Dream Demon cans at your local Second and Charles store. You can also pick up G Fuel Dream Demon in a 40-serving powdered energy formula tub and limited edition collector's box, which includes an exclusive A Nightmare on Elm Street stainless steel shaker cup. And you can get that right now at gfuel.com. Get 20% off your first order when you use code GEEK20 at checkout. So, welcome to prime time for energy.
What was another example of Frank Darabont trying to push back on you, and you're like, no, Frank?
If I was definitely the McCartney and the Lennon and McCartney, so believe me, Frank is edgy. And a terrific writer, but I can't think that one in particular. He was very upset with me.
What was how did you and Frank Darabont come together as writing partners, and how did that dynamic look?
We have been great friends over the years, and I actually was a line producer. I think I got a producing credit on a horror film that Frank was driving a camper on. And I don't know if Frank likes me telling this story. He wasn't the best timely driver, and I didn't know him very well. And I was thinking, we have to replace this guy. And the costumer said, listen, he's a great writer. You ought to read some of his scripts. And I read a script. I believe it was a spec script for MASH, which was still on the air at that time. And it was terrific. I just said, look, man, you really should be writing. And I made my first deal with Frank saying, there's a script idea I have. Why don't you write the first draft, and I will pay you better than when you were driving. And then I rewrote that, and I asked him to read it, and he rewrote that, and we realized, at least I did, I thought this was a potentially great team, and we worked in the future, and we were both very happy to make it happen at that time. The climax of that relationship was Frank brought me a script called Shawshank Redemption while we were writing something else, I believe, for Universal, and said, what did I think of it? He was about to lose the rights to it unless he did something with it. A Stephen King novel. I'd never even heard of the novel at the time. And it blew my mind. I said, it's not only a good script, it's literally the best script I've ever read in my life. And I encouraged him, he was being offered a lot of money to sell it. And I encouraged him to direct. I knew that was his goal. I said, this is it. You're not going to have a better situation than this if you control this material. By all means, go now, go forth. And I actually finished that particular screenwriting project myself, and said, you need to go put this deal together, make this movie happen. So I just was knocked out, and then the movie itself was as good as the script. I mean, it really was one of the best scripts I've ever written. It blew my mind.
Yeah.
I've ever read. I've ever read.
Maybe the story is out there about Frank having written a spec script for MASH. I've never heard that before, but I totally see it. I totally see his sensibilities applied to that. It just, and as an interesting aside to me, I guess, we've talked a little bit about the paranormal stuff that I do, and Shawshank Redemption not only changed movies and is now, I think it's a rule of TV that you can flip through cable and you will always find Shawshank on, but it also kind of saved this famously haunted location called Ohio State Reformatory, because that's where he filmed part of the film, and he saved that structure from being torn down, and now it continues to stand as this historic landmark. And so, weird legacy.
I wasn't aware of that. It was an amazing location, though.
Yeah. So I mean, about the Dream Warriors script, like something I've just always loved is it's super lean, it jumps right in, there's no time wasted, and it feels like you've trimmed so much of the fat, so we're just getting meat. But you show up on set, and by all accounts, you're still a child. You're not even 30 years old yet, I don't think, when you're starting this production. And you had this tight deadline. You're picking up a third installment of a franchise that is somewhat, on wobbly legs. Talk about that pressure.
I think it's interesting because I was so excited to finally get to direct. One never knows if you're going to get that break. Even though I planned it, I got the rights to the Blob in order to leverage Hollywood into letting me direct a property. And New Line passed on the Blob, but they said we really need someone to address the potential of a third Nightmare on Elm Street. So I jumped right in. So yeah, it was a lot of pressure. You need to do a good movie as your first movie, or you're not going to have any other movies. So it's interesting because the documentary about Elm Street 3, there's one very good one. And the cast talks about how hard I was on them. They loved the movie, but I'm like, well, we got some pretty good results. How bad can I have been? I think I was putting pressure on myself and on the cast, which included Patricia Arquette, and all the wonderful actors, Heather from the original, of course, and Freddy himself, Robert Englund. And I really had a high goal, which we seem to have achieved in caring about the characters and not making it ludicrous. So yes, I had a lot of pressure on myself. I had a certain number of days to do it in. We had practical effects that are always dicey. I wouldn't do anything that was in any way not safe, so everybody was in good shape. The big giant snake Freddy that gobbles Patricia seemed a little dangerous. It wasn't that heavy, but there was a mechanism inside of it. So you've got to think fast. It's what's great about independent film. So I said, let's just do a reverse load. We were using film at the time, and pull it off her. So that gobbling Patricia is actually just a simple reverse trick that I did to make sure she didn't get pinched by the gobbling mechanism. Mm-hmm. But the result is still pretty interesting.
Yeah, and as far as the tension on set, like Heather has said that it was a tense set. Other people have said it. It's like, but again, you had to turn around this film in a very short amount of time. I mean,
though I got to give Bob Shea credit, because that was pretty much self-imposed pressure. I wanted to make the most out of what I had to work with and the time I had to do it in, and because I knew Wes's original was already a classic, so I had a lot to live up to. But I had a great time, and I believe they did too. I think they seemed to still retain that sense that they were under a lot of pressure. I wanted the best out of everybody.
Well, success and legacy helps helps the hindsight, I think, quite a bit. Was it a challenge for you as such a young director, also coming in and establishing yourself and creating a dynamic with Robert Englund, this now third entry in the Freddy franchise? Is like, he's an established actor at this point. He's the star of the franchise. You're the young upstart director. How did you manage that initial?
We had a common love of theater. Not every actor has got classic training or even any experience in theater. Robert does. And we had stagecraft in common, theater craft in common. So we spoke that language. So we hit it off right away. I wish I had kept some of the in those days we had answering machines that had tape, and I had some hysterical messages when Robert would call me as Freddy. And in the Freddy character, say, "Russell, where are you? I'll see you in your dreams," shit like that, which was pretty, between that and Rodney Dangerfield from Back to School. I wish I'd kept some of those crazy messages. Anyway, look, Robert's all in. That's a tough kind of part to play. You've got to trust the filmmaker that you're out there on the edge with some imaginative but violent ideas. And he loved that I was taking the character into a kind of dark comedy. I think where the rest of the series started to get a little silly eventually. But it always seemed to please the fans, all those Elm Streets.
Yeah, we really see sort of the template set for who Freddy is, and then it continues on, and it gets a little bit more comedic and at times slapsticky. It's maybe a difficult question to ask, but have you ever thought, like, what hath I wrought?
I have no guilt about it because the third worked, and I knew it at the we had a screening that was kind of cast and crew, and one of the things that's too bad is the situation between New Line and Wes was not that great at the time, and I don't have a point of view on that, but I didn't get to work with Wes. I got to work with Wes's script, and so when Wes showed up for our first screening, I thought, oh boy, this will be interesting, and I hadn't seen it with an audience at all, and it rocked. Sometimes you can just tell, okay, this is going to work for audiences. And I know Wes was very impressed. He came with Tobe Hooper, who I was also a fan of. So I'd never met Tobe before. And, look, God bless both these guys. They passed on, but we all will. We all will. But the truth is that meant a lot to me, that particular screening, and the fact that those two filmmakers I looked up to were impressed.
The thing that always stands out in my mind about Nightmare 3 is we have these two final girls. And so that always kind of sticks out for me. And then you also have these very imaginative, tailor-made kills, like form-fitted to the victims. It's almost like this very intimate death. And I just kind of wanted to get your perspective on both those categories and the inspiration behind going in that direction, and then how you feel like it contributed to just the genre overall.
I'm glad if it did, and I've had young filmmakers telling me that Elm Street 3 and the Blob were things that inspired them. Joe Lynch is about to come out with a new movie, and he specifically told me a couple of times that he was inspired by the Blob and is a big fan. But look, I wanted to go further into dream imagery. And again, New Line was a little nervous about me putting Freddy in different costumes. Freddy wore a tux at one point. And it became a thing, later, but they had to have trust in me to get Freddy out of his striped shirt and into some wilder situations. But I thought the audiences were ready for it. So I'm sorry, I forgot. Am I answering a question or am I rambling?
I mean, yeah, I threw a lot at you, but I was saying sort of the imaginative tailor-made kills, which kind of speaks to.
So yeah, they were tailor-made. I wanted to make sure there was a set-off. H.G. Wells once wrote something about writing fiction that I've never forgotten. It's always struck me as so true, and that is, when anything is possible, nothing is interesting. So I just think it's telling authors to have organic sensibility to the story. Where are you going? So I wanted each character to have a character issue that reflected what was happening in their nightmares, which is truly what happens to us. So I wanted their nightmares to somehow reflect on their fears and who they were as people. Ultimately, I think the reason that film was so popular, we can overcome our fears. That's the subtext, is that you can overcome your fears. You can find your power even in your dreams. This is also true. And whatever scares you the most is a challenge that's just going to that's going to force you to grow. So that's a subtext of the film. And not to get too corny about it, but it plays, and you're rooting for those kids. And when they finally realize their love for one another, their fellowship, bonding together in a dream, is one way to defeat this kind of ultimate evil. I think there's universal truths in some of those things. So I don't want to, overhype the film. I did it because it entertained me so much, and I wanted to bring something a little fresh to the audiences. I knew I had to go further than they did in the original first two. So I thought, let's get bigger dream. Let's go deeper into dreams, deeper into dream imagery, and make Freddy almost a Bugs Bunny character who can jump in and out of these dreams in different characters if he wants to. And maybe this led me to The Mask eventually, this kind of thinking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which easily could be a horror movie.
It was meant to be a horror movie.
Yeah.
As you and I think have discussed. And I felt as a horror film, it would just be too much like Elm Street. In the awesome comic book, it was a sort of we called it splatterpunk. It's a black and white comic with a lot of blood. And the Mask would pull a axe out of his magic pocket and chop people up and, make a pun. And I thought, really, if I do a good job, it's going to be very, very similar to Freddy with the kills and the lines. And Jim Carrey was on this scene. I've always reacted to explosive talent like that. I'd never seen anything like Jim. I saw his stand-up, actually. I'd seen in Living Color, and I saw his stand-up. It blew my mind. I said, this guy should be the Mask. No one understood what the hell I was talking about initially. But again, I give credit to Bob Shea and Mike DeLuca in that case, that they had faith in me to try something they'd never seen before in any film. Mm-hmm. It was the original at the time, and CGI was something brand new. I just thought this is a fantastic combination. No one's ever seen this before. Let's go.
Do you have myths associated with your career that you would wish to dispel? Like, I'm thinking with Nightmare on Elm Street 3, I don't know whether they're myths or not, but things like the studio was concerned about the Freddy snake being too phallic, or Ken Sago's getting the role because he cussed you out, things like that. You could confirm or debunk any of these myths.
I was the one who thought the snake was, I was always the bad guy. I was the one who, when I saw the snake Freddy, it was very pink and erect in its initial position. So it was like Freud would have fell out of his chair. And I saw this friggin', 8 or 10 foot tall thing and just said, we're screwed. And again, you gotta think on your feet. It was bright pink. And I said, we got to make this thing more green right now. So let's get some green filters on the lights. Let's get some green slime the thing down. And so you'll see it's subtly off its pink and into green. But it ultimately, probably I shouldn't have been concerned, because something a bit Freudian in a nightmare is probably a good thing. But they never had a chance to see it the way I did, because of course these things are ready on the day you need to shoot them on an independent film. So it wasn't the studio. I was the one who said this thing really looks super phallic, and we're going to have to come up with a style that makes that less obvious. There's a lot of myths about I wouldn't shoot this baby, and it's true. That's actually true. I saw a Burt Child, and I just couldn't handle the imagery. So that was not shot. But all in all, it was on me. It was on me. The studio's only concern was Freddy in different costumes. Freddy taking off the hat was even a big deal at the time. But Robert was behind it. Robert was rooting for it. So with his support, I got to move ahead with that sort of thing.
There's this weird kind of like, it's always fascinating when a film spills into the real world, and then you have sort of this real-time interaction with your own work, I would imagine. And what I'm specifically thinking of is you and I were having a chat at a San Diego Comic-Con party, and it was not advertised that Chuck Russell was going to be there. This was not planned. And then this cosplayer comes in dressed as Freddy, but with the syringe claws. That
I love. Yeah, no, he's a pretty good costume too. So I couldn't resist. I had to introduce myself to him and say, look, I directed that film, and you're looking good. Good job, man.
What is your reaction how's that make you feel as a creator when you see this thing that's 36 years later, and someone is bringing it into the real time? Walk me through.
I tell you what, it's fun. I love when I feel I affected pop culture in some small way. It means the film has done what it's supposed to, gets in the fans' heads, the audience's heads. The thing that I admire recently is Freddy with the hypodermic figures has become a bit of a meme. Now that we're in a period where all these injections are controversial and people have to figure out what they want to do for themselves. I'm glad somebody pulled that image up and reintroduced it into pop culture. So look, I mean, that's the job. We want to entertain people, number one. It's not about self-aggrandizement, but when any imagery pops up, I think even the film The Nun reminds me of the haunted nun that was playing Freddy's mother in Elm Street 3. So I like when we affect things, it means it's successful in that way.
Well, and it's it's a legacy too.
That's true.
With the Blob, this film, not for this interview, but I recently rewatched the original and your version of it, and the initial one, Steve McQueen, who I'm pretty certain was pretty old to be playing a teenager, but the initial one is solid. I mean, it is a good movie, but you kind of, with your and Darabont's take on the Blob, it's more of an anti-authority film. There's this kind of conspiracy theory thread that moves up, very much of the Reagan-esque, time, I would say. Perhaps edgy, even though it's a sci-fi movie about a blob, it's still got this edginess. And I was just thinking, if Chuck Russell was to tackle this material in 2023, 2024, what would the messaging be with that? How would you do the Blob today?
That's an interesting question. I don't really have a great answer, because it's when you make these films, you put your blood, sweat, and tears into it. And at that time, it was a little forward thinking. If a bunch of guys in biohazard FEMA type suits take over your town, maybe you should wonder if they have your best interests in mind. That was the subtext that I thought made it worth the remake. Was, they're not all good guys. While the concept of the Blob I really liked, because it was just pure evil. It wasn't complicated, and the ever expanding notion of it. And frankly, I thought, even though the 50s film was, a resonant hit, there's so much more we could do with physical effects. And I tried hard to go CGI because it was out there, but it just wasn't ready to do anything that organic. So there is one CGI shot in the Blob, which is at the end when it's frozen. We did some freezing things and some twinkles with what we traditionally think of now as CGI, kind of ahead of the curve.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the comment on hazmat suits and guys taking over your town, for me, that was burned in pretty early. One of the earliest movies that I actively remember was E.T., the Extraterrestrial, and
Sure.
Talk about a movie that teaches you to distrust, as a kid, distrust authority figures.
That's true. That's true.
Well, let's move into Witchboard before I let you go, because you're reimagining this film that, when the original came out, it was very much reacting to sort of this new legacy of Ouija boards as these portals to hell and devices of evil. So for you, what is kind of the appeal of kind of taking on Witchboard, and talk a little bit more about your adaptations of the franchise?
Well, Kevin Tenney, who did the original, did a fantastic job, and there's been many Ouija boards since, but I think his was the first one. I mean, certainly, I'm not a complete cinephile. Certainly, it might have appeared even in silent films. But the Pendulum Board preceded it, and is honestly, I like games in movies, and I like movies built around a magical prop, which I did in The Mask. So it's the Pendulum Board we created for the film, the whole design of the piece, is a source of magic. It's kind of a portal. Pendulum boards were outlawed by the French Pope in the 1700s. because they were popular and people were divining with them, telling the future and raising spirits. Once they were out, you could get hung or burned as a witch if you had one eventually. And that gave birth to the Ouija board that did not use a pendulum. So the motion of the pendulum, these are really cinematic things. Maybe this is a little technical for the audience, but I've really taken advantage of what that board is. And again, have brought a lot more imagination and another element in dreams and even time travel into that story. So I just knew it was a springboard, and we all want to create a franchise. Witchboard was a 3-picture franchise. So we were very inspired by it, but I knew a little bit like what I did with the Blob. It needed to, was the original is a launching pad for this story. So
yeah, and it's interesting because, you know, the Ouija board, it was this sort of parlor game, and not, you know, in pop culture wasn't really considered this evil thing until The Exorcist and Captain Howdy in 1973. And that's, you know, that kind of launched. It was also in the early stages of what we would come to know as the Satanic Panic, which would then eventually include Dungeons and Dragons. And so this kind of planchette Ouija board became this pop culture boogeyman. Is that now something that, with this pendulum board, are you wanting to dispel that and move away from it as a boogeyman a little bit?
I'm not competitive with that. I just think the Ouija board movies have been done, and different aspects of it have been done since Kevin's movie and what Blumhouse has done, which was fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
But you'll see, it's not just about spelling out letters and calling a particular spirit.
Well, just based on what I've seen, the footage or the trailer, there also seems to be this very intentional nod and inclusion of Wicca and spiritualism and these belief systems. And it doesn't seem like, even though you can use these as launching pads for scary devices, it doesn't seem like you're treating the witches or the spiritualists as patently evil or to be demonized.
You picked on an interesting thread, because there are what's called white witches. There's all kinds of different people that practice what we would call witchcraft, with good intentions. There's also people with bad intentions. So another thing that's been done to death is the really old crone who's 100% evil, that you can only catch glimpses of, and it can be terrifying. But that's more of a shadow than a character. And you'll see we go into, why was our dangerous witch? What happened to her that made her go to the dark side, let's say. So I don't want to give any spoilers, but I thought Witchboard required a witch. And I've did some cursory study of Wicca, and I'm very interested to see what people who consider themselves witches think of the film.
I think that there's an author named Heather Green who wrote about the history of witches in Hollywood and the evolution, from, the Wizard of Oz, even before Wizard of Oz, to the crone, to the evil witch versus white witch. And I think that from what I have seen, and I've just seen a trailer, but from what I have seen of Witchboard 2024, it seems like there is that sensitivity about the belief system. And that's something that I think is actually really important, because people are practicing this out there.
Yeah, I don't want to say anything too controversial, but the whole Wiccan thing can be a gateway drug to more troubling things. But as I said, I think there are well-intentioned people practicing Wicca. I think the Christianity is the strongest magic you can have in your life. So even these days, that's controversial to say. But I think I investigated Wicca somewhat honorably in this film, rather than do what I've seen before.
Now, there's a lot of theories that when you're even filming about occult and supernatural forces, maybe whatever's out there doesn't recognize that this is a film set. Anything weird that is carried over to the set that you're like, okay, this is peculiar?
Probably the set we call the Witchy Woods, where there's some pagan dancing, and we introduce our witch character, played by a marvelous actress, Antonia Despa, who I think is going to become very big. In my mind, she already is, a French-English actress. That was pretty interesting. We shot there for 2 or 3 nights, and I can't point to one thing, but it was fun. It was a little scary, and we also introduced a very interesting cat that's one of the characters in the film, where our live cat, a little bit like the mask, the dog in the mask, the live cat did all its stuff. We have to use very, very little CGI. We thought we were going to have to use a lot of CGI because you can't train cats, and I only deal with cruelty-free trainers, so it's not like the cat's going to be uncomfortable. But you'll see. Again, I don't want to brag. I want people to discover how interesting I feel that cat is.
With your career and your track record of these mega hits, I mean, you've earned the right to not work. So when you're launching this Witchboard, is this something that you want to set up a whole new franchise and do sequels and come back and just direct?
Absolutely. We hope to see Witchboard universe, and that's what we talked about recently, me and my partners on the show.
And you've, because of how much work you've done, I mean, you're still interested in being in Hollywood. I mean, like, Hollywood must have changed so much from when you first started at it.
The only thing certain in the film business is change, whether it's the corporate structure that is kind of overwhelming, as one studio buys another, or whether it's the technology itself. People have been freaked out about change in Hollywood since there were talkies. They thought that would end movies, and certainly did change in that there was a whole new breed of actors that were speaking performers, and then color, then 3D, and ultimately these are just different tools for storytelling, but it does create basic changes in the structure of the business. So now the tech is we're all little movie studios with our cell phones running around, and I encourage young filmmakers, there's apps you can edit what start shooting, don't wait. Mm-hmm. If you have a good cell phone, you can make your own movies these days. So I like the concept of independent film thriving. I hope that happens or continues to happen. This film was shot independently, and yet we need our studio partners for distribution. And I hope to make a wonderful studio film again. Should one come up, I'd be delighted. But I like being a little more entrepreneurial at this point in my career. Well, so it's certainly changed, and definitely some of it's for the better. And it all boils down to the individuals. You can get a great studio executive that really adds something to a picture. In an independent film, you're your own master, and you put your own brain trust. You surround yourself with your own best people.
Well, final question for you, because I know you got to get back set, but because it's spooky season and because you've created, this, landmark horror movie, and you're creating another one that will be seen in 2024, any scary stories from your childhood, from you as an adult, any urban legends you grew up with, creepy house at the end of the block? Tell us a Chuck Russell true scary story.
I avoided the real stuff when I was in high school. I wouldn't do the story I recall justice, but I don't recall all the details. But there was a old monastery where supposedly a monk's body was preserved in the Chicago area, and some naughty kids broke in. So that was in my imagination, but I wasn't daring, and I wasn't a vandal in those days, so I didn't participate. But I loved hearing those stories. And I've always loved telling scary stories, even just verbally around a campfire. So, I'm amazed that I was able to make a career out of that. And I'm grateful. Work hard and see what happens is my advice.
A lot of good stories for the campfire and for big screen and across the board. Well, Chuck, thank you so much for your time today, my friend. And for everyone out there that is waiting to find out, stay tuned, because Witchboard is coming in 2024. And my guest is Chuck Russell, director of Nightmare on Elm Street 3, The Mask, Scorpion King, so many films that are part of pop culture. And sir, I appreciate your time today.
Thank you. Glad to see you again, Aaron, and my best to your team.
Thank you, Chuck. And I'm Aaron Sagers, and this has been Talking Strange. Until next time, be kind, stay spooky, and keep it weird.
Alrighty, spooky nerds, it's now time for another edition of the segment of Talking Strange we call Creepy Collectibles and Curios. Creepy Collectibles and Curios. Okay, no, it's still not there with the jingle, but we will get there. So, the point of this is that when I interview people, it inspires me to buy stuff based on things that they're saying. And of course, I was speaking to Chuck Russell, the director of A Nightmare on Elm Street 3 Dream Warriors, which is really one of my favorites of the Elm Street franchise. After the original, I think it might be my favorite of the franchise. But I realized I don't have any Freddy Krueger action figures. I used to, I don't know what happened to one of them, but I was like, okay, well, let's go online. So I went to eBay, let my fingers do the tapping, and I found this Freddy Krueger Dream Warriors figure made by NECA. And NECA does great sculpts, great figures. And this one, what I love about it is, okay, his face, Freddy's face, is in this very believable, looks lifelike snarl that you can really imagine him saying, "Welcome to prime time." His hat is removable. He's got a little puppet figure with him from another scene in the movie, and a replaceable head. The other head has the cross burnt into his forehead. But really, the kicker here for me is that Freddy has those hypodermic needle hands from the film that have really become quite iconic and associated with this flick, and what Chuck and I actually spoke about during the interview. So this NECA figure that I found on eBay, this specific one, is going for $42.50. That's because the box is somewhat dented in, but it still looks like it's in great quality. And I don't know about you guys out there, but when I get an action figure, that puppy's coming out of the box and it's going to get displayed somewhere, so I don't care about the dented box in this case. So that's what I found based on my interview with Chuck Russell and being inspired to go buy stuff. So went to eBay and found this sweet deal. Be curious to find out what you found on eBay. Perhaps you found another Krueger action figure that you picked up. Let me know about it. Anyhow, that is another edition of the segment that we are calling, until we change the name, Creepy Collectibles and Curios.